Welcome everyone to the first of our LAN Legislative Committee webinars for the 2019-2020 school year. My name is Karen Walters and I'm the LAN Legislative Committee chairperson. As we told you at Summer Institute, we'll have a series of webinars this year in addition to our LAN legislative meetings in an effort to engage you as members in the legislative process. We hope to gather feedback from you and to also provide some education about topics that are of interest to all of us. So just a few logistical things about our webinar today. First of all, today's webinar will be 1 hour in length. We intend to have 45 minutes of presentation and 15 minutes for question answer. We'd like to record this. We are recording this and we're going to house it on the LAN website for future reference. Throughout the webinar, if you could please write down your questions and hold them to the end, we will have that 15-minute time period to answer those questions. Also, if you're having technical issues, could you please chat those technical issues so that Carla and Susan can help you through the chat. So I'd like to take a second to introduce our guest speakers today. As you can see, we have 4 people who will be presenting today. I will be presenting later. My name is Karen. Margot Hernandez Rainwater will be presenting later on, and she is one of the newest members of our LAN Legislative Committee. Sherry Munyon, who is our LAN lobbyist, will be presenting for part of the time. And then Eric Neschheim, who's also on our Legislative Committee, will be helping with today's presentation. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Eric to start out our webinar.
Thank you, Karen. We're just going to spend the first few minutes talking about the importance of the reason why we should all be part of the legislative process. And I see as we get more people on, there's obviously some interest in this. And I'm sort of one of those people who likes to promote this because I've seen the value over the years. I've been in the field for a really long time. So I guess I'd start out by saying that without the advocacy that we've been doing, without sort of this resource that we have, this legislative committee, this Literacy Action Network group, we essentially wouldn't exist, in my opinion. And I can take that back to, sitting in a meeting 20 years ago where we actually came up with the modern day formula. And, that came about because we had been, prior to that, doing advocacy work. And so we had the foresight to have a lobbyist, 20, 25 years ago, and consider this as a really important topic. And so when we got to the point where we're sitting at that table and there was a whole bunch of people from around the state having this discussion, we were prepared with what we needed to do and what we needed and what we wanted. And that's how we ended up with our modern day formula. And it had to do with the fact that many people were already prepared and ready to do this kind of advocacy work. And the other piece to remember, I think, is how important it is.
I think you just muted everybody.
A lot of times what happens is you get what you need and then you move on. And what we've done is that we've continued this advocacy process throughout those years, making friends with the people that we needed to make friends with. And that's because the field has rallied around the successfulness of this process. So it's important to sort of have that as our baseline. Important also to know that what we have is something very important here in Minnesota. So when you compare us to other states, for example, when I go to conferences around the country, one of the things that people say when I say, I'd like to talk about how we've done it in Minnesota and how successful we've been at trying to get resources, et cetera, they look at me and they say, well, you're Minnesota. But the reality, and meaning that we're successful, we have more money than other groups. I know we don't have enough, but the reality is 20 years ago we didn't, and it was a process. And so maybe we do now, but it took a lot of effort and time. It wasn't just luck. So in that sense, I think we're a very unique state in that we prepared ourselves, and we have a great setup here where we have a Literacy Action Network type organization. We have a Department of Ed that's been a great partner all these years, and we have a lot of good partners around the state that can go out and do this advocacy work. Another thing to remember is that in some ways we are lucky in Minnesota. And that's partly because of the way our legislature is set up and because of what a hometown we kind of are. Uh, Years ago when Jesse Ventura was in office, that I like to say, what's the thing that scared me most about Jesse Ventura? And lots of people have different comments about what that might be. But the one thing that scared me the most about him was his idea of a unicameral legislature, which would mean that we had essentially, I don't know what he was proposing, but maybe 100 legislators, as opposed to the number that we have now, which is House and Senate members. As is now, we have great access to our legislators here in Minnesota. Lots of states don't have the kind of access we have. So we're very lucky in that sense. You know, One other thing to remember is that, I think it's a little scary to think, oh, I'm going to have to go talk to this legislator. But the reality is, our legislators here in Minnesota, particularly House members, aren't elected by a lot of votes. I was looking through the numbers from this last election, and there were legislators who were voted into office with less than 8,000 votes. That means that every vote counts. Sherry, who's going to talk in a minute, gave me this little sheet about, information about how one vote has made a difference throughout history. And it's just amazing throughout history, some of the things that could have happened or should have happened if only one more vote had been placed. You know, Apparently we could have actually gotten rid of slavery earlier if somebody hadn't gotten sick that day. So it's just crazy how important one vote is. Our legislators are, normal people like you and me. There's no reason to be scared to go and talk to them. And I think the more you do this work, the more you figure that out. They're just kind of your neighbor. Um, Also important to remember that we are a very important voice, and maybe individually we're not that powerful, but as a group in Minnesota, adult basic education, we're, if you count learners who are going to be voters at some point, we're 65,000 people. That's a lot of people. Legislators respond to lots of people. And there's, like I said, every vote counts. So just a couple of calls to somebody makes a big difference. So we're a big voting bloc. Another, I think, really important reason why you should care about this is because individuals can make a pretty big difference. Like I said, we're kind of a small town here in Minnesota. So in the past, we've had a number of experiences where somebody knew somebody who knew somebody, or somebody's neighbor is in the legislature, or somebody's neighbor's wife or husband. And we've actually been able to have influence in those cases. In one case, particularly a couple of years back, we were having some struggles with something, and it all came down to a legislator from Rochester who was, the chair of the committee and had the final vote on things. And we were able to talk to the program coordinator down there at that point, Julie Nigan, who was very good friends with this legislator. And so she was able to call her up on her personal cell phone and say, this can't happen. This is really important that this doesn't happen. And she was able to stop it. So there's lots of cases. I keep hearing people who are, friends with the governor's wives, so and so. It's all really important. It is a really small town, and individuals can have a big influence on the process that we're doing. So again, my topic is why should we care? And I think it's obvious why we should care, but at the same time, we can really make a difference. And I'm glad that you're all here listening and that we can have a wider discussion about how all of this looks. I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, who is going to talk about how our legislature works for the next 15 minutes or so. Are you there, Sherry?
Thank you, Eric. I am. Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again. And I'm going to address how the legislature works. And I'll start out with just a little bit of an overview on the Minnesota legislature itself. As Eric already alluded to, is a bicameral, meaning a two-body legislature. We have a House and a Senate, and our Senate is 67 members and our House is 134 members. That means we have 201 voting legislators. When bills go to the floor, every one of those legislators has the opportunity to vote for or against it, or vote for against amendments to the bill on the floor. However, all of those legislators don't serve on all of the relevant committees. Our legislative session, we have a biennium, meaning we operate on a 2-year basis, 2-year calendar. The first year is odd number, and that's our long session. generally running from the beginning of January through the end of May. And this is the budget setting year. And a lot of attention, most of the attention is spent on setting all of the state agency budgets. The short session, the second year of the biennium, any bill introduced in the first year is still considered alive for action in the second year. And that includes both funding and policy bills, although funding bills are harder to pass once it has been adopted. So the second year is generally considered a bonding or capital investment year and also a policy year. So the next slide that you're going to see is a little bit about how the bills are drafted. And a bill for an act is actually a proposal by one or more legislators to change current law. It can also be a proposal to create a new law or a proposal to repeal or eliminate an existing law. And when the bill or act passes both the House and Senate, it becomes called a proposal to the governor from the legislature. And every bill has to be signed by the governor before it becomes law. The only exception to that is a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment goes to the citizenry. If they adopt it, then it becomes law. So what's on the slide right now? Just a couple of lines there. This is the bill that LAN introduced during the last legislative session, the appropriation bill to increase funding for ABE. The bill was sponsored by Representative Lee and Senator Clausen. You do not have to have both a House and Senate author, but it's much easier to pass a bill if you have a bill introduced in both bodies. And the chief or the lead author on each bill is called the chief author. They're the individual who generally presents the bill in each of the committees it goes through. We try to have more legislators sign the bill to show broad support. That might be across the aisle, bipartisanship. It might also be to show that there's support between the metro area and greater Minnesota. The legislators who sign on after the chief author are called co-authors, and they are very important in the process as well. In fact, in some instances, if your chief author isn't available, when the bill is up for a hearing, one of the co-authors will step up and present the bill to the committee. So our Minnesota legislature obviously is elected by citizens, and always keep in mind that it's their job to listen to you, the citizens who vote for them, and it's your responsibility to educate the legislators. And by that, it isn't a one-time contact. You don't have one meeting with your legislator. I encourage you to have multiple meetings and think of it a little bit as a cycle. You want to meet with your legislator before the legislative session begins. You want to check in with them during the legislative session, and then you want to check in with them at the end of the legislative session. And during that time, they become acquainted with you. They're also going to be more likely to ask you for your opinion. Eric had also addressed the issue of a legislator contacting their local ABE manager. And this isn't unusual once you've developed a relationship with your legislator, particularly when they're getting conflicting information. And that is important because, of course, legislators also listen to people and organizations who have opposing views. So it's critical that they have good information and that they know the issue impacts their district. If they don't hear from anyone in the district, even if we tell them that it's an important statewide issue, if there's any conflict on funding or policy and they don't hear that it's important to their issue, then it allows them to make a different decision. And our goal, of course, is to influence the legislature while they're developing policy and working on funding. And this is the role of both the association and the lobbyists, but also the role for citizens. And the next thing I want to let you know is how few bills actually pass in any given year. Up on the slide, you'll see that I've got about 10% of the bills become law in any given year, but sometimes it's not even close to 10%. As an example, in 2019, 78 bills were signed into law by the governor, and over 2,900 bills were introduced. I'll add a little caveat to that, saying when we develop omnibus bills at the Capitol, multiple bills can be included in the omnibus bill. So when I talk about the 10%, you know, that's generous because it does include the inclusion in omnibus bills of issues that might have been introduced separately. And then one more example, in 2018, that would have been a short session. We had 1,800 bills introduced and 100 bills passed. And I give you that information just to let you know that passing a bill is difficult, and you can introduce a bill in the House and Senate, and some of those bills won't even have a hearing because there isn't enough time for the committees to process all the bill. And then obviously all the bills that are heard don't become law. And some of the bills that do become law look quite a bit different than the way they were introduced at the beginning. So there's several steps for a bill to become law, starting with an idea. An idea can come from an association such as Literacy Action Network. However, an idea can also come from an individual citizen about an issue important to them directly to their legislator. The idea has to get drafted into a bill. There's a legal process and format for that. The legislature actually has what they call a revisor's office. All bills that are introduced come out of the revisor's office. As a lobbyist or an association or a citizen, we can't go to the revisor's office and ask to have a bill drafted. A bill may only be drafted after a request by the author, meaning one of the legislators from the House or Senate. After it's been drafted properly, it's jacketed. That's a term that's used at the Capitol. Yellow jackets for the House, green jackets for the Senate. And you put your authors on the bill, drop it into the hopper, and then it'll go to the committee. And if the committee has a bill recommended to it or referred to it, it can just sit there with nothing happening to it. Legislators who are the authors of the bill have to request a hearing. There's a formal process to ask to have the bill heard, and even that doesn't guarantee that the committee chair will put it on a meeting to be heard. We often have to lobby the chair and the committee administrators to get the bill heard. And the busier it is during the session and the more bills, the harder we might have to work to actually get the bill heard. After the bill has heard in committee, if the committee adopts it, passes it out, there's a couple of different routes it can take. It may have to go to more than one committee. I've had bills go through as many as 5 separate committees, which is very difficult sometimes to get all the way through the process in a timely manner. But if especially you're going through 1 or 2 committees, then the bill will go to the floor for a vote. And when it gets to the floor for a vote, there's different names for the calendars they use to bring the bill up. In the House, they call it the General Register, and that's basically a list of all the bills that have passed out of committee and have been sent to the floor. In the Senate, they call it the calendar for the day. Same thing, a list of bills that have passed the Senate and made it to the floor. And it's important to keep in mind that a bill may pass out of committee in the House, but not pass out in the Senate, and vice versa. So the special orders, this is where legislators, leadership in the House and Senate will prioritize bills. So you may have a list of, let's say 150, 200 bills that have been sent to floor, and the leadership will put out a calendar each day with somewhere between 5 and 15 bills generally that will be heard that day on the floor. Once a bill passes off of the floor, if it does, and it passes off of the House floor, generally there are differences between the bills. different committees, different legislators have had a chance to amend the bill. So a conference committee, which has 5 members of the House and 5 members of the Senate for major bills, 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate for smaller uncontroversial bills generally, will get together, review the differences in the bill, and come to an agreement on a final bill. When that final bill has been agreed to, it's redrafted and it's sent back to the floor of the House and Senate. And assuming it's passed by both bodies a second time, then it's finally on its way to the governor. And the governor has the opportunity to sign the bill, to veto the bill, or if he or she are ambivalent about the bill, they don't have to sign it, but it can go into law without the signature. If the governor opposes the bill, there's still an opportunity for it to become law, and that's by a legislative override vote. This is very difficult because it requires 2/3 of the legislature to override the governor's vote, so it rarely happens. The next slide that's coming up is a little difficult to read, but it's really here intended to show you the different steps I just mentioned in more detail. So that's a little bit more of a comprehensive view than what I walked through. So again, our collective work is to influence the actions of the legislatures. I think the key thing to remember is whether it's between a lobbyist and a legislator, or whether it's between a teacher and a legislator, the key thing is this process is all about developing relationships and building trust. And I would add that we do not limit ourselves to only lobbying legislators. We're also involved in working with agencies, departments. So for instance, Minnesota Department of Education, we work with the governor's office to make sure his policy advisors know what the LAN legislative agenda is. And we also work with other state associations who are involved in education who might be of help. And in closing, I have one more slide here on the process. And this is homework assignment for you. So earlier I mentioned who the chief authors of our bill were during the last legislative session. And they had worked hard for us and advocated for ABE funding, actually had the proposal in the House bill. The Senate bill did not include any new funding for ABE. But it's really important when legislators go to bat and talk to their caucuses and talk to committee chairs on our behalf that they be thanked. Obviously, I've already done that as your lobbyist, but it's really important for them to hear from you that you appreciate that they took the time and spent the energy to advocate for you. So on the presentation, you will find the access information to the House and Senate websites where you can look up your legislator's name and just send them a very short email. Tell them thank you for introducing the bill for ABE. Hope they'll continue fighting for an ABE increase, and a couple of sentences from your district's perspective on why that's important to you. In closing, I'm going to piggyback off of Eric's mention of one vote making a difference. So one vote makes a difference at the Capitol. Your contacting legislators can bring us that one vote that we need on legislation. But I also want to remind you that being a part of the election process is also critical, and letting legislators that represent you know that you voted for them is also critical. And I particularly hear a lot in my world that people don't vote because they think the system is messed up, legislators don't get along, they can't agree. Well, not voting isn't going to make that any better. And if you think that a vote doesn't make a difference, as Eric also said, there are many, many issues where it has, both in elections and in policy. And I'll give you a couple on the presidential election. President Andrew Johnson President Andrew Johnson wasn't convicted because the Senate had been shy of one vote for the 2/3 majority. He survived impeachment in that way. And obviously that's kind of relevant in terms of current events as we're talking about impeachment once again. So that's the reason I brought that example. That one vote saved him from impeachment. And in 1876, it was also one vote that made Rutherford B. Hayes the 19th president of the United States. In 1876, there was a presidential election between Tilden and Hayes, and Tilden had won the popular vote, but because of and by a healthy margin of 250,000 votes. But when the electoral votes were counted, Hayes received 105 electoral votes and Tilden had 184 votes. And we've seen in recent elections here where this electoral vote also makes a difference. So it's important for you to be a part of the process, and we look forward to your assistance as we go forward. Thank you.
So at this time, I thought it might be helpful for our membership to see what the timeline looks like for the 1920 school year, and then we'll close with some advocacy ideas. So going over the timeline, things happen in kind of a consistent order here in Minnesota, and people often ask, when would be a good time for me to send letters? When would be a good time for me to invite legislators to our site? So I just wanted to kind of go through that. If we look at starting with summer, because we usually think of starting our school year probably July 1st, summer and early fall are good times to invite your legislators to visit your programs. And I know for sometimes it's not good for summer because we don't have a lot of students at our sites, but you could meet with your legislators by having coffee with them, just bringing them to your site and talking with them. If it's maybe one of the first times you're meeting with them. And it's always great if you can invite them to events you have at school. So typically what we do in Mankato is we invite all of our legislators to our graduation ceremonies, which are usually late spring, early summer. And then we try to have a coffee date with them sometime in the summer at our site. In the fall is a good time to invite them when your students come back, if you can do that. Another thing would be to attend what's called listening sessions or town hall meetings. I know that there are a lot of town hall meetings coming up in the fall. A lot of times there will be listening sessions prior to an election. And if you can go to any of those, it's a really good way to start getting involved. The next thing that will happen in late fall is our LAN legislative platform will be finalized. And our LAN legislative platform simply outlines the things that we want to accomplish with the legislature that year. In addition, our state budget forecast comes out, it's usually announced in November. So at that time, you have an idea, or Sherry actually has an idea of what is available for funding that legislative session. And then in the winter, the session begins. And like she said, on the odd years, it starts in January, but on the even years, it starts in February. And that date is wrong. It should say 2020. February 11th, 2020 is when we will start our session this year. And they will have a spring break, April 6th through the 13th. So it would not be a good time to visit the state capitol between April 6th and 13th. And it also, throughout that legislative session from February 11th until May, that's probably not a good time to invite your legislators to come to your programs, unless you're going to do that on the spring break. Because they're busy. They're doing that whole process that Sherry just talked about, and they're not going to be coming out to see people at their sites. However, it is a good time for you to take your students to the legislature between February and May. This year, we set a date of March 9th to be our ABE Day at the Capitol. So we'll be getting more information to you throughout this year at our webinars about how that's going to happen. Once you visit with your legislators, it's a great idea to send thank you cards like Sherry just mentioned. Whether you go up and visit them during the session or have them come to your site or have coffee with them, it's a great idea to send thank you cards so that they you keep that contact, that steady contact with them. It's okay at the end of the session to send a thank you card, but express your disappointment in what didn't happen. If you had something that you were pursuing and it didn't happen, it's okay to express your disappointment about that. At this time, we are believing that possibly Margot had a situation that prevented her from attending our webinar. So she is not currently on as far as we can see. So I'm going to attempt to talk about her slides, which would be how you can get involved in making a difference. Margot put together this this pyramid of different ideas for you. And we're encouraging everyone in ABE to get involved at some level, at any level that they feel they can be involved. At minimum, everyone should identify your legislators. And you'll notice at the top of this pyramid, there is a link where you can click and go and find out who your legislators are. You want to put in your home address to know who your legislators are for where you live, but you also want to put in your work address because you can advocate for your ABE program or for where you live. And you are considered what's called a constituent for that legislator. So they want to hear from their constituents, which means the people in their districts. They want to hear from you. So it's more meaningful if there's a legislator, for example, in Rochester, it's more meaningful for the ABE manager in Rochester to make contact with that person, for example, than it would be for me to make contact or Sherry. Because they want to hear what's happening locally with their hometowns or their district's ABE program. So one of the things you can find out when you find out who your legislator is you can go to their website and you can find out their newsletters, you can sign up to receive their newsletters, and you can find out which committees they serve on. If they serve on an education policy or an education finance committee, then you are a key person in our state that we want to be in contact with because you could influence policy and finance for LAN. So you should know the LAN legislative agenda, which is simple. We send it out in the fall and you simply need to become aware of what we're advocating for. And then you can just find out more about your legislator and get to know them. And that's a process over time. It's really not something that happens once or twice and it's over. It's an ongoing event where you're just continually getting to know them, inviting them to your activities at school, having your students visit with them, going to their town hall meetings, going to their listening sessions, sending them emails when you need to. LAN will tell you when things are happening in the legislature because you'll get alerts through your email if you're a LAN member. And just responding to those particular alerts in a timely manner is critical to us getting the agenda passed that we need to. In the end, we often have what's called postcard campaigns. I know COAB talks about this, where we have all of our students send thank you cards. And that's a very effective thing to do. Sometimes students will write letters to the legislators about their situations. I have had legislators say that they received a big packet full of ABE letters or thank you cards, and it was very exciting for them. What else did you want me to say, Sherry?
One additional item is when you are identifying your legislator and you look them up on their website, there's a place there for you to click on and enter your email address. You don't have to enter your home address or your telephone number, and you can sign up to receive legislative updates from them. And that's good. You'll get a chance to see what issues they're working on, some status reports on things at the Capitol besides education, and also their town hall meetings are usually announced there. Thank you.
Okay. I know that one of the things Margot was going to talk about was how she found the easiest way for her to become involved was to go to a local town hall meeting. And the first time she went, she really just went and listened. And, oh, I think that Margot just arrived.
for a minute to get on.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Margot.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
We're good. I just went through your slides here, this whole pyramid, but I haven't talked yet about your experience in going to a town hall meeting, and I'd like to have you share that if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you so much. And my greatest apologies, everybody, for being late. I got caught up in another meeting. Anyway, as hopefully you were able to see the slides and talk about how you identify your legislators and the committees that you're on. And I did experience with the group that when I first started, I was so terrified of meeting any of my legislators. I was terrified of going to town meetings, and I had no idea who was within my district or which district I had. So the first thing I did is I decided just to go to a town hall meeting that I saw advertised by my state representative. And I really thought it would be a scary thing. And I walked in there, and I was able to meet with my representative. I was able to listen to what they said. And at first I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to engage. But then as I got more and more comfortable speaking and with my legislators and understanding what the process was and exactly what bills were being introduced and exactly what were the values of my representative and what they had voted upon, then I felt more comfortable being able to engage with them and actually speak to that. So one of the really important things about this is not only to get to know your legislator, but also know exactly what they're doing, know exactly how they voted and what committees they're on. That is so very important. And as a matter of fact, you'd be surprised because I sent an email to Amy Klobuchar just recently and said, do you feel like going and having some coffee with me? And she said, certainly, I'll meet you. I've got about an hour in my schedule. And she was just wonderful. She met me in Red Wing and we sat down, had some coffee, and got to know each other very well. And so it's not, they are not untouchable. They're people just like us, and they love to have coffee and they love to sit and talk. And they're always looking for people to help them with their cause. So I do suggest that you take those initiatives and get out there and actually visit with your legislators, get to know them, and you'd be surprised how they are more than willing to help you out and to listen. And one of the more important things that I want to point out is always remember you are the expert in the room. They don't know. They don't know what we know. And they actually start asking us questions because they're counting on us to know what's going on with the boots on the ground. So, I just always want you to remember that as great as they are, many of our legislators, and some maybe not so much, but as great as they are, remember you are the expert, you are the educator, and you know what's going on when boots are on the ground. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Margot. At this time, we are concluding the part of our webinar that's content, and we want to open it up for questions or discussion. So if you have questions, if you could raise your hand, you can either chat your question in, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you, and then you can make sure you can ask your question. Oh, there's a hand raised.
Oh, I think they did that again. Whoever you were who put your hand up, please
Somebody-
put it back up again.
Maybe it was a joke. They didn't really have a question.
They put up their hand and then they took it. I can't believe it. Actually, themselves.
Okay. It could be a question, a comment, or share an experience would be great too.
Just wanted to text chat.
Okay.
Matthew Miller says, is there a role for volunteers in this process? Would their voice help sway legislators? So volunteers as opposed to staff.
Absolutely. The same as a teacher, the same as myself, a board member, you have an equal voice. Your role in this field is going to be respected by legislators equally. So please do get involved and contact your legislator.
Whether you're a volunteer or a paid staff, it doesn't matter.
Correct.
Okay.
Just a concerned citizen.
Right.
Right.
And I think in fact, volunteer, they sometimes even have a little bit more impact because they're using their own time and resources, and they aren't perceived as necessarily trying to get resources for themselves, even indirectly.
Sure.
And just this past summer at our National Night Out meeting, I had a nice chat with my next door neighbor about the ABE funding and what had happened in the legislature last year. And I talked about my role in LAN, and he happens to know my legislator. They're connected socially. We all live in the same neighborhood. And he's like, okay, well, I'll talk about it with him. Now, in this particular case, my legislator is Jim Dabney, who's obviously one of our big supporters. So, you know, not going to break any really big new ground here, but it's always good to have allies.
Yeah.
So yeah, just making sure that your neighbors know about it, and business people in your community, anybody can be an ally.
And I would just follow up on that and say, even when a legislator is an ally and there's a lot of competition for limited resources, the more voices they've heard from, the better.
And I would like to add, I started off as a volunteer, just putting up signs or handing out buttons, and then I became more involved with my legislator, with everybody that surrounds her, and it has been just a phenomenal experience because it's made me more enlightened about my role as an educator and what my rights and my responsibilities are to my community. So yes, being a volunteer can take you a long way down the road.
More questions or comments in the chat?
Yeah, just a thank you from Matt.
Okay.
Matthew.
I guess I could talk for a second about my experience in developing a relationship with Nick Frentz. And Nick Frentz does not serve on the education policy or finance committees. However, he, I think he's probably been in the legislature now for 2 or 3 years. He's fairly new. He's a senator. He is a local attorney in Mankato. And I had no interaction with him prior to him being in the legislature, but my supervisor through our district had invited him to come and hear from ECFE and ABE together. So we had a little sit-down coffee with him for maybe a half an hour one day, and he didn't know what ABE was at all, really. Never had experienced really anybody needing a GED around him, had heard about it, but didn't know where people went to get that service. So we were able to just educate him that we exist at that first meeting. And he knew all about ECFE, of course. So then I invited him to graduation, and he did not come. Then we went up to the Capitol one day to talk to our legislators, and I called him out of the session from the floor, and he came out and he knew who I was. He knew my name. He remembered me, and he didn't have any idea that I was with LAN. So then he was like, oh, you're involved at a statewide level. I said, yes, Mankato and at a statewide level. And so he basically said to me, you know, Karen, I don't know how all this ABE stuff works, so you're going to have to tell me what I should say. Mm-hmm. And so I said to him, no legislator can know everything. I don't know everything. I don't know how you would know everything. So if you ever hear ABE and you don't know how to vote, or you don't know what to do, or you don't know what it means, then you call me and I'll be the person who will help you through that. And he was like, that sounds great. So and he said, I know people who are on the committee, so I can talk to them. So then time goes by and I visited with him multiple times. We had him come to our site. We had a student lead him around and give him a tour of the facility and talk. And at the Tim Walls celebration in Mankato, he was there. He saw me and came running up to me and asked me to hold his beer while he went and talked to somebody, which I thought was hilarious. So within 1 year, we went from not knowing each other at all to he knows my name well enough to have me hold his beer for him. So when I went up to visit with him at the last time, it was in his office this time, he knew who I was and what I was advocating for and was able to give me some advice. And now I feel like if I need to talk to him, he'll know who I am at minimum and what we do. But it can quickly develop from not having any awareness to just, that knowledge of what is going on and who to go to. If he ever hears ABE, I'm sure I'm the person who pops into his head and he would call if he needed help with something. But that can happen pretty quickly. You just have to maintain it.
I'm just curious, were y'all able to show everybody the government track website by any chance?
I'm going to move back. Are you talking about the top one on this box, Margot?
Yes. If you want to share my screen, are you able to do that? I can show everyone something that I was referring to earlier.
Do you want to do that, Carla? Take it off of me and put it on her?
Just for 2 seconds.
Hang tight.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay.
Say yes or share or something like that.
Yeah, let me see. So, are y'all able to see my screen?
And it says you need to click allow so that people can see you.
And I did. Let me.
Oh, it was there for a second and then it went
Oh,
away.
okay, let me try it again. Is it there?
Yes.
All right. So one of the really cool websites that I go to is called Government Track. And the reason that I go to this website is anytime I want to know about any of my representatives or my legislators and I want to see the way they vote or I want to see what they're doing or actually where they're at, this gives me an analysis. It gives me the ideology chart. It tells me what committees my representative is at, what bills they have sponsored. It actually gives me her voting record and if she missed any votes or how often she was there. So if I go to a town hall meeting, which I did for one of my representatives a couple of years ago, and he missed a ton of votes and I questioned him, there were, so many roll calls and you missed this many percentage of votes. Can you explain to us why you were not there to vote for us? And so these are the kind of questions that you most certainly are open to ask your legislators and get involved. And not only that, it kind of gives you the idea of when you do decide to volunteer, you do decide to become part of our advocacy group, you can actually speak to exactly what your representative has sponsored, what type of bills they're looking at, and also most importantly, what type of committee membership that they are on. So I just wanted to share that real quick because out of all the links that I sent you, I think that this is the one that I use most often. So I wanted to make sure y'all had that. So does anybody have any questions about this? Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. There.
All right.
Thank you.
If we don't have any further questions or comments, I think we'll wrap up our first legislative webinar for 1920. In the materials, this will be stored on the LAN website. There will be materials attached to that. There is a list of webinars that are happening throughout this year. The next one will be in November, and it will be about how ABE funding formula works. So we will see you in November. Thank you.